Title cards love shredded monsters and 8-pack champions, but MMA history has always had room for the big boys. Today we're talking about the heaviest, thickest, most gloriously blob-shaped fighters who ever waddled, stomped, or shuffled into the octagon. Let's see what we have here. 600-pound sumo mountains, beer-bellied knockout artists, shoey-chugging maniacs, and whatnot. These are the giants who broke every visual rule for what a fighter should look like, and still became unforgettable parts of UFC folklore. But before we dive into the content, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but to us it means a lot. Thanks. Now, without much ado, let's begin. Emmanuel Yarbrough, the final boss blob. When people talk about true giants in MMA, Emmanuel "Manny" Yarbrough is the image that pops into everyone's head. He was a sumo and judo fighter from Rahway, New Jersey, who played football and wrestled for Morgan State University before moving into combat sports full-time. During the 1990s amateur sumo boom, he became the world amateur sumo champion in 1995 and became one of the most famous non-Japanese sumo wrestlers of that era. For UFC 3 The American Dream in 1994, the promotion billed Yarbrough at around 616 pounds against karate and kempo fighter Keith Hackney, who was around 200 pounds. That huge gap makes him the largest fighter ever to compete in a UFC bout, and the records list him at about 6 feet 8. Outside the octagon, his weight later climbed past 700 pounds, and Guinness World Records recognized him as the heaviest living athlete at over 319 kilos, roughly 704 pounds. The fight is classic early UFC chaos. Hackney drops him with strikes. Yarbrough hauls him in and even shoves him clean out through the open cage door. They restart, and Hackney finishes with punches at 159 of round 1 by TKO. A 6'8" frame carrying over 600 pounds of mass with a torso wider than some opponents' reach is precisely why fans still point to Emmanuel Yarbrough as the ultimate MMA blob. Thomas Ramirez, 410-pound Goliath. If you want peak massive blob gets humbled energy, Thomas Ramirez is your guy. He turns up at UFC 8, David vs. Goliath in Puerto Rico, introduced as a terrifying puncher from the local scene. The tale around him was simple, huge, scary, and supposedly packing ridiculous knockout power. On paper, he's a nightmare matchup for any normal-sized heavyweight, until reality checks in. The numbers are what make him mythic. Ramirez was officially announced at 410 pounds on fight night, one of the heaviest men ever to compete in the UFC, with that short, wide, thick build that screams human wrecking ball rather than pro athlete. Across the cage stood Don Frye, a much smaller but well-rounded fighter who could box, wrestle, and actually move his feet. What happens next is one of those clips MMA fans never forget. The bell rings, Ramirez comes forward. Frye meets him with a clean right hand, then another. Ramirez collapses in a heap, and the referee waves it off just 8 seconds into the very first round, one of the fastest finishes in UFC history, and easily the quickest way a 400-plus pound aura has ever evaporated on TV. And yet, that single night did its job. Whenever people talk about the most gigantic men to enter the octagon, Thomas Ramirez is always on the short list. An unforgettable example of how even a 410-pound blob can get deleted by sharp technique and calm violence. Taylor Wiley, UFC 1 Mountain. Before he was the lovable food truck guy on Hawaii 5-0, Taylor Wiley walked into UFC 1 under the name Taylor Tuli and looked like a boss character from another universe. He was a Hawaiian of American Samoan descent, a former high school football lineman who turned into a serious sumo prospect in Japan. Under the Shikona Takamishu Daikichi, he fought for Azumazaki stable, racked up a 57,274 record and reached the Makushita division, making him one of the largest and most visibly big foreign sumo wrestlers of the late 80s. By the early 90s, he had come home, shifted into pro wrestling and MMA training, and signed on for UFC 1, the beginning in Denver. For that one and only MMA fight, Tuli was listed at over 400 pounds on a 6'2" frame, a round, massive silhouette that instantly sold the no weight classes, anything goes marketing the UFC was chasing. His fight with Dutch savate specialist Gerard Gordeau was the first UFC bout to be televised. Tuli charges, loses his balance, and Gordeau rifles a right high kick straight into his face. Teeth fly. Later reports mention several stuck in Gordeau's foot and at least one ending up in the crowd, and a follow-up punch forces a TKO stoppage at 0:26 of round 1. For UFC diehards, Taylor Tuli is the original UFC blob, a 400-plus pound ex-sumo whose one violent, lopsided loss set the visual tone for how wild this sport was willing to get. John Matua, 400-pound bone breaker. If you're a hardcore fan, you probably grew up on old-school UFC highlight DVDs, and you've seen this guy's fall in slow motion. John Matua walks into UFC 6, Clash of the Titans, as the terrifying bone breaker from Hawaii. Introduced as a practitioner of the Hawaiian martial art Kapu Kuialua and marketed on commentary as a system built around joint destruction and crippling techniques. On paper, he's a monster. Listings and UFC records put him at around 400 pounds on a frame that was only about 6 feet 2 inches, which makes him one of the heaviest fighters ever to step into the octagon. No tall, stretched-out giant here. Matua is compact, thick through the torso, with a colossal head and wide stance that make him look like a boss character squeezed into a normal-sized cage. Across from him is Tank Abbott in his MMA debut. And what happens next became instant folklore. Tank blitzes forward, nails Matua with a brutal right hand and follow-up shots, and the 400-pounder collapses backward into that creepy, stiffened KO that burned itself into every early UFC montage. It's a knockout loss in under half a minute of round 1. You can debate the bone breaker gimmick all day, but you can't argue the scale. A legit 400-pound heavyweight, short, wide, and moving like an avalanche in slow motion. That's why John Matua will always live in fans' minds as one of the purest blobs the UFC has ever dared to put on TV. Koji Kitao, Sumo Yokozuna blob. Now, up next, we have an almost real-life anime boss walking into a cage. Koji Kitao was not just a big man. He was Futahaguro, the 60th Yokozuna of sumo, the top rank in the entire sport, and the only Yokozuna in history who never managed to win a top division championship. After a brutal fallout with his stablemaster, he was kicked out of sumo in 1987 and reinvented himself in pro wrestling in the early 90s. By the time he dabbled in MMA, he was a walking monolith. Records list him at 6'7" and around 390 pounds, fighting as a super heavyweight, carrying that classic Yokozuna upper body into a discipline where guys are supposed to cut to 265. When UFC booked him for UFC 9, Motor City Madness in Detroit, they were selling exactly that visual. A Japanese sumo star, twice the size of some of the regular roster, squeezed into 4-ounce gloves. Across the cage stood Mark Hall. Hall opens with a low kick and a punch to the face. Kitao drives him to the fence and slams him down, but the damage is already done. The shot has shattered his nose. There is a moment of delay, then the blood starts pouring, and Big John brings in the doctor. Official result, TKO by doctor stoppage in under a minute of round 1. A 6'7" ex-Yokozuna at 390 pounds, getting his nose blown up in under a minute on pay-per-view. That is pure blob chaos, and exactly why Kitao stays on every largest humans to enter the Octagon list. Roy Big Country Nelson, the belly with a bomb. You look at Roy Nelson, and your brain does not say elite athlete. It says that an uncle at a barbecue got lost and wandered into the cage. Then the bell rings, and that same uncle starts ending people's nights with one punch. Nelson is a heavyweight from Las Vegas, Nevada, a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under Renzo Gracie, who built his career in the IFL, Elite XC, and other shows before the UFC ever called. Most fans met him on The Ultimate Fighter, Heavyweights. He ran through the season, then knocked out Brendan Schaub in the finale with a right hand and a follow-up shot at 3:45 of round 1 to win the TUF 10 tournament and a UFC deal. From there, he settled in as a fringe top 10 heavyweight, officially listed at around 6 feet and 260 pounds, and always carrying that famous hanging gut over his shorts. The blob energy comes from the contrast. Soft midsection, mullet, beard, and then violent KOs over big names. Nelson iced Stefan Struve in 39 seconds, flattened Chake Congo at UFC 159, and stopped legends like Mirko Krokop Filipovic and Antonio Bigfoot Silva. The right overhand became his trademark, a looping grenade that could erase a fight in one clean connection. That huge belly, the casual vibe, the walk-off shrug after another KO, all of it turned Roy Nelson into the modern template for a UFC blob. The guy who looks like a meme and still has the power to shut the lights out on elite heavyweights. Chris Barnett, the acrobat blob. Chris Barnett is what happens when a heavyweight blob decides it wants to move like a bantamweight anime character. Officially, he's a 5'9" heavyweight, usually around 260, 265 pounds, with a short, round frame that looks completely wrong for the division until he starts throwing spinning stuff. Long before the UFC run, he built a career in smaller shows and overseas, mixing taekwondo flair with big man chaos. Most of you fell in love with him at UFC 268. Usman versus Covington 2 in Madison Square Garden. Facing Gian Villante in Villante's retirement fight, Barnett spends a round finding his rhythm, then detonates a spinning wheel kick to the head in round 2 and finishes with punches at 223. That knockout earns him a Performance of the Night bonus and one of the loudest pops on the prelims. The celebration seals the deal, a wild, joyful front flip from a 260-plus pound body, right there in the center of the cage. He does it again at UFC 279, this time against Jake Collier. Barnett actually misses the heavyweight limit, coming in at 267.5 pounds, gets battered early, then roars back and scores another second-round TKO at 224. Short, chunky, and somehow throwing wheel kicks, flips, and comeback TKOs, that's why Chris Barnett isn't just a big guy in the division. He's the acrobat blob, living proof that an actual unit can still fight like a highlight reel. Tai Tuivasa, Shui Island Tank. Tai Tuivasa is chaos in heavyweight form. A proud Western Sydney banger of Samoan descent, he came into the UFC as a former rugby league kid turned knockout artist, bringing street fight energy and island boy swagger to the most dangerous division. He trains out of Australia, walks out to Celine Dion, and somehow makes it all feel perfectly normal once the punches start flying. On the scales, he's a 6'2" heavyweight who hits that 265-pound limit, and outside fight camp, he's openly admitted to ballooning over 300 pounds between bouts. The build matches the reputation. Big belly, thick legs, round shoulders, the full walking tank silhouette that still somehow moves fast enough to trade in the pocket. The UFC run is pure violence. Tuivasa slugged it out with Andrei Arlovski and edged a decision early on, then reinvented himself with a KO streak over Stefan Struve, Harry Hunsucker, Greg Hardy, and Augusto Sakai. It was all before that insane 2022 war with Derek Lewis, where he survived early danger and knocked Lewis out cold with an elbow in Houston. Later that year, he stood across from Cyril Gane in Paris, dropped the slick Frenchman in round 2, and nearly pulled off the upset before getting finished himself. Every time, win or lose, he leaves dents. Even after that, he's kept taking killers in the top 15, win or lose. The violence never really stopped. And of course, there's the Shui, climbing the cage, chugging beer out of a stranger's shoe while the crowd loses its mind. Big gut, heavy hands, party energy. Tai Tuivasa is the modern UFC blob you can't help but root for. Mark Hunt, thick king of walk-offs. Mark Hunt is built like a fridge and hits like a car crash. Born in New Zealand to Samoan parents, he made his name long before the UFC as a heavyweight kickboxer, grinding his way through K1 cards until he won the K1 World Grand Prix 2001 championship, a legit world title in heavyweight striking, not some gimmick. Physically, he's only about 5 feet 10, 178 centimeters, but he's a compact 265-pound unit with a soft midsection, massive legs, and a barrel chest, the definition of short, thick heavyweight. When he finally signed with the UFC after a rough MMA start in Pride, he turned that stocky silhouette into one of the most feared right hands in the division. The highlight reel is stupid. Hunt starched Stefan Struve at UFC on Fuel TV 8 with a left hook that shattered Struve's jaw. He clobbered Roy Nelson at UFC Fight Night 52 and literally walked away the second he knew Nelson was done, giving fans another trademark walk-off KO. He fought Bigfoot Silva in Brisbane in 2013, producing a 5-round majority draw that's still considered one of the greatest heavyweight fights in UFC history. He also wrecked Antonio Bigfoot Silva in their rematch and stopped legends like Frank Mir with that same calm, brutal precision. Soft around the middle, granite in the chin, and ice cold when he lands the finish, Mark Hunt is the thick king of walk-offs, proof that a true blob can also be a world-class striker. Marvelous verdict. At the end of the day, these 9 blobs are more than punchlines about gut size and gas tanks. They're living proof that fighting has never been a one-body type game. Some of these giants got wrecked in seconds. Some scored legendary knockouts, but every single one of them dared to drag a very unconventional frame into the most unforgiving arena in sports. So whether you love shredded contenders or fridge-shaped brawlers, remember, the UFC's history is heavier, messier, and a lot more fun because these massive units showed up. Even with all this heavyweight chaos, we know we've missed a few fan-favorite blobs like Shamil Gaziev. So, if we missed your blob, let us know in the comments, and we'll see you in the next one.